Tonight we are privileged to welcome two of the most accomplished figures in the world of humanitarian aid to discuss what's happening to the U.S. foreign aid and refugees resettlement programs. The U.S. Agency for International Development was begun by the late President John F. Kennedy in 1961. And the Refugee Resettlement Program, USRAP, which is less well known, began in 1980. Both are now being dismantled. The results are there for all to see. When an earthquake with a magnitude of 7.7 hit Myanmar last week, or the week before last, it took days to send even a small U.S. reconnaissance team in. And just after they arrived, they received their termination notices. Jeremy Konyndyk, our first speaker tonight, headed the U.S. Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance for 4 years. It may have been, in its time, the most competent, and I know this as a reporter, most competent relief agency and disaster relief agency on the planet. Its name changed, its location in government changed, but it kept on doing the same job until now. Now, Jeremy tells me, the function is gone. As for refugee resettlement, that is to say, vetted immigrants fleeing wars and persecution. The United States had the world's biggest program, taking in 3.6 million refugees since 1975. This year, the program was supposed to manage 125,000 incoming refugees. They use nonprofit agencies, most of them faith-based, to organize the resettlement. Krish Vignarajah, one of our council trustees, we're so lucky to have her on our council trustee list, is the head of Global Refuge, which is the single biggest of those faith-based agencies. But in late January, they received a stop work order, and their funds were frozen. Global Refuge, which had settled over 100,000 refugees last year in the United States, had to furlough a quarter of their staff. Now there are about 100,000 refugees in the pipeline, or the number may be even slightly higher. They have been approved conditionally to come here to the United States, and now they're just waiting somewhere for the go-ahead. The U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program was the biggest in the world. And yesterday, it shrank still further. The Roman Catholic bishops halted a century-old resettlement program that they worked on with the resettlement agency. One reason, they are owed $24 million by the U.S. government. And I guess they don't know what the prospects are for collecting that sum of money. The issue of refugee resettlement is still before the courts. In fact, even tonight, as we speak, a lawsuit is underway in Seattle brought about by the nonprofit agencies. We'll have to see how that turns out. Something may happen in the course of our meeting, in fact, tonight. Are these programs finished for good? Can they be revived by a future administration? I'll ask Jeremy Konyndyk to speak first and give us the big picture. He heads Refugees International, one of the foremost advocacy organizations for refugees in this country. He had directed advocacy for Mercy Corps, another top agency, and he had a very important job at AID, as I mentioned earlier. He served on the transition team for the Biden-Harris administration. He's a graduate of Calvin College and Georgetown University. Krish Vignarajah will focus on refugee resettlement, how it works, or how it worked, what's left of it, where it goes from here. As I've said, Krish is the president and CEO of Global Refuge, formerly known as the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, with a great heritage since World War II. She previously served in the Obama White House as policy director for First Lady Michelle Obama, and as a senior advisor at the State Department for Secretaries of State Clinton and Kerry. She is a graduate of Woodlawn High School here in Baltimore. And she attended Yale, where she received a BA in molecular biology and an MA in political science. She was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, where she received a master's degree in international relations. And then she went back to Yale for a law degree. That's a lot of majors going through. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
I'm going to focus mostly on what has happened to USAID, but I also want to talk for a few minutes about what's happening with the targeting of legal migrants in this country, and then I'll kind of pass that baton to Krish to talk about particularly the Refugee Resettlement Program. But I think there's some commonalities across all of these that are really important to understand and to emphasize. So as Roy said, I lead Refugees International. Refugees International is an independent humanitarian and refugee advocacy organization. And that means that we focus specifically on policy and advocacy around refugee, humanitarian, and asylum issues. We do not maintain permanent field programs anywhere in the world, and we do not take money from governments or from the United Nations. And we make both those choices, which are pretty rare in our sector, but we make both those choices to maintain independence for moments like this one. Part of Refugees International's model and purpose in the sector is to be an organization that can sometimes be very loud at times when our peers cannot. And the last few months has been one of those times for a lot of USAID partners. A lot of USAID partner organizations have, as Roy mentioned, with I think the USCCB being owed $24 million, there are many USAID partners that are likewise owed in the tens and a few even in the hundreds of millions of dollars by the U.S. government for work already completed. Whether this is, it's kind of a version of Elon Musk famously stiffing his contractors, not paying his bills. We're now seeing that brought to the U.S. government writ large, and very acutely for many of the USAID partners, many of whom now are facing bankruptcy, consolidation, restructuring as a result of what is happening. So we are very fortunate and very privileged in that ecosystem that because we make the choice of never taking U.S. government money, it means we are always quite small, but it also means at times like this we can be quite loud, and we've tried to use that to great effect over the last couple of months. So I want to talk about what's happened to USAID. And I think it's important to understand it, whether or not you care about foreign aid, and I would imagine that if you are attending the Baltimore Council Foreign Affairs, you probably do. Thank you, by the way. We need more people like you. But even if you didn't care at all about USAID and didn't care at all about foreign aid, it's really important to understand what has been happening because it's a game plan and a template and a model for what is being done now more widely across the federal government. USAID was the trial balloon. And we are now seeing some of the same patterns that were used to dismantle USAID also being applied to the National Institutes of Health, to the Department of Education, to the CDC, and other parts of the federal government. So I want to walk through that. And I will try to leave on, I don't know if there's much of a note of optimism at this point, but I will try to find, if not notes of optimism, at least notes of activism, because I do think it's important to understand not just what they're doing, but the significance of how they're doing it and what it says about the level of actual support that this administration has for some of these actions. Sorry, and then I just got to open my phone again so I have my notes in front of me. So to start from the beginning, there was a chapter on USAID in Project 2025, the policy game plan for the Trump administration. It said nothing about dismantling the agency. It actually praised a lot of what the agency did. It had plenty of criticism too. It described what it characterized as wokeness run amok at USAID. I can say, having served at USAID in the Obama administration and then in the Biden administration, with the Trump administration in between, we did not wokeify it significantly relative to what we inherited when we came. I was part of the day one team that landed at USAID at the beginning of the Biden administration. There was a lot of continuity. You'd never know that from the rhetoric, but in fact, there was a lot of continuity from Obama to Trump to Biden. But Project 2025 kind of painted this caricature of a woke agency that had focused all its attention on promoting LGBTQ plus agendas and so on. And there was some of that, and I would stand by a lot of that personally. But your mileage may vary, and clearly this administration's does. What it did not propose, and what really shocked everyone, was that right out of the gate, USAID was basically being targeted for destruction. And the debate, even in the days prior, the kind of scuttlebutt within the NGO community was, okay, well, who are they going to name as administrator? And if it's this guy, that'd be all right. If it's this guy, oh boy, that's going to be pretty rough. Nobody was really thinking that they would just shut it down. And it was a little bit weird that of all the national security senior leadership positions, USAID was the one that had not gotten a nominee as we came into the new administration, but nobody thought too much of that. Not totally unusual. And then in the raft of executive orders on the first afternoon of the administration, there was one calling for a 90-day pause on foreign assistance and a full foreign aid review. It was very ambiguously written. Ambiguous to those of us who served in government and know how to read these things, ambiguous to the people in government who were supposed to interpret and apply that guidance. And so it was unclear what exactly that meant. And we got more clarity just a few days later when, so the president was inaugurated on a Monday, and Friday of that same week, the State Department issued what became known as the Global Stop Work Order, which was an order halting not just the issuance of new programs, but the issuance of any payments for any purpose whatsoever, even for work already completed, and the immediate stoppage of all foreign assistance activities around the world, period, with only the narrowest of exceptions. And so this threw USAID and the whole of the humanitarian and foreign aid sector into turmoil, because you can't just hit pause on a feeding program in a refugee camp. You can't hit pause on an emergency nutrition program. If you hit pause on an emergency nutrition program, children die. That's why they're in the emergency treatment. You can't hit pause on global HIV programs, because if people are off their antiretrovirals, and the U.S. supports about 20 million people, or did 20 million people around the world on antiretroviral treatment, if that is disrupted for even a month, their infection can begin to rebound. So huge turmoil in the sector. And likewise, a lot of confusion about how to apply this, what this means in practice. Does this mean that money that is already basically processed and out of AID's hands and being now kind of sent to partners through the HHS payment system now also needs to stop? Just mass confusion. Within a few more days of that, the State Department put almost 60 senior staff at USAID, basically all of the senior career, what are called SES, Senior Executive Service. Some of you will know that term. All of the senior executive service and many of the lawyers at USAID were put on involuntary administrative leave. And the reason given was that they had defied the executive order. There's very little evidence of that. I think the actual reason was to begin decapitating the agency. And that then gave way very soon to Elon Musk and the team from Doge showing up at USAID. And within a few weeks of that, or I think within just a week or two of that even, Elon Musk issued his famous tweet saying, "I spent the weekend putting USAID through the wood chipper and the agency is dead." And it wasn't at that time dead. I think it is more dead now. But what's really important to understand is none of that was done through any kind of illegal, constitutional, or otherwise appropriate channel. USAID is established in law by Congress. It was originally founded under executive order by John F. Kennedy, but it was in the 1990s established in law as an independent agency by Congress. It has an appropriation issued by Congress. One fact that I always want to point out, to be sure to point out to people, because there has been a lot of, I think, intentional disinformation about this, is that USAID does not, in fact, control its own budget. Its budget is written by Congress. So when USAID is spending money on HIV programs or education programs or what have you, they are doing that. They are doing that at the direction of Congress and at levels directed by Congress. So that has been very obscured, but it's important to understand because the kind of public narrative that then began emerging from Elon Musk's Twitter feed and being amplified by the president and being amplified by the Secretary of State was again to paint USAID as a rogue agency, as an agency that had become a slush fund for kind of radical lefty Marxists and was defying the political direction of the administration. Now, none of that was true, but it was a really important campaign because that was then the basis for saying, well, this whole institution is so irredeemably corrupted that the only option we have is to shut it all down. So it was a version of kind of big lie theory, that if you tell a big enough lie, you create enough smoke around that lie, people will assume there must be some truth to it, and that only if the lie is big enough can you justify the sort of unlawful, unconstitutional destruction of a federal agency that we saw with USAID. So what were some of those lies? Well, there was one of my particular favorites is not maybe the best term, but like one of the most notable was one that came from Elon and then was amplified by the president, that they had found a payment for $50 million of condoms to go to Gaza. When I heard that, so I've done some work in public health in my career, when I heard that, my immediate thought was, I wonder how many condoms that would buy. And so, because the USAID buys a lot of condoms and gets really good bulk deals on condoms, because they're a really, really important tool for preventing the spread of HIV, amongst other things. So I called up a friend of mine who works for a reproductive health organization, and I said, well, how many condoms would this buy? And he said, between 1 billion and 1.2 billion condoms. Population of Gaza is about 2.2 million people. So to think that anyone anywhere in the U.S. government was on the cusp of sending 1 billion plus condoms to Gaza is lunacy. At one point, the president, in fact, doubled that and said it was $100 million, so then that would have been 2+ billion condoms. The point being, there was no attempt to be factual. There was no attempt to be accurate. It was the play with a lot of these claims about USAID is to portray it as so outlandish that you couldn't possibly defend that. But none of it, and then there's an assumption there too that no one will do that basic work of checking the fact, checking the accuracy of it. And so I talked to a lot of journalists about that billion condoms. It was, for most of them, it was the first time they'd ever actually done the math on how many condoms that would be. And and there were many, many instances of that kind of a claim. There was a point at which Elon Musk put something in his Twitter feed bio about circumcision, and that was to mock the fact that USAID funds circumcision programs through its HIV programs because it involves penises, so it must be hilarious. And it is a sort of 13-year-old. I have 14-year-old sons, and they are more mature than that. So it's not even like 14-year-old juvenile humor. It's just absurd. But it's sort of an absurd mockery to make a mockery of the institution so that it kind of creates a permission structure for destroying it. For what it's worth, circumcision programs are one of the most cost-effective ways of preventing the spread of HIV. They reduce the risk of HIV infection by about 2/3. So there are good reasons why some of these things are done, but if they sound funny to someone who doesn't know them very well, that's the point. That's the purpose. And the assumption is no one will stop to bother to understand why we're doing these things or why these things are important. And so you can just kind of do middle school mockery, and that creates the permission structure for targeting the agency. And so what that was really about was creating a smokescreen in the public eye and intimidating Republican politicians and Republican members of Congress who knew much better what the agency did and knew much of this was not true, to kind of intimidate them into silence, to prevent them from sticking up for the agency that many of them, up until a couple months prior, had been very supportive of. And they then proceeded with an unlawful destruction of the agency. So they have yet to do any official congressional consultation on this. There have been a few informal briefings. There has not yet been a hearing in which a U.S. government official has actually shown up to testify before Congress on what they're doing at USAID and what they plan to do with the foreign aid mission of the U.S. government. Meanwhile, a gentleman named Pete Morocco, who is kind of the architect of this at the State Department, has continued to fight tooth and nail not to pay partners, has put moves in motion to terminate all USAID personnel, and to terminate more than 85, at this point it's about 85% of all USAID programs around the world, with more terminations dropping every few days. And there was another wave of terminations of life-saving humanitarian programs just over the weekend. None of that has been done lawfully. None of that has been done according to the Constitution. And what this creates is a situation that involves multiple constitutional violations, starting with the Congress's power of the purse. So as I said earlier, USAID is not unilaterally deciding how to spend money. They are spending money directed by Congress. So when USAID puts it's about I think at USAID it's about $3 billion a year worth of HIV programs. They're doing that at that level because that's what Congress told them to do. Well, that congressional directive still exists. The congressional directive to spend the global humanitarian budget every year still exists. The congressional directive to spend X amount on education and X amount on water programs and all of these things, those all still exist in law. Those are the law. And the administration is lawfully required to spend that money for those purposes. And they've completely destroyed any infrastructure for that to enable them to do so. So that is setting up a situation where either there is no oversight of U.S. foreign assistance programs, or that money does not get spent and it becomes an impoundment case. Impoundment being there's a law that Congress passed that said once Congress appropriates a budget, the president can't decide to unilaterally not spend that money. The president has to spend money that Congress has appropriated and the president has signed off on. And that's a really fundamental balance of powers issue in our Constitution. So there's a constitutional issue there on the budget side. There's a constitutional issue as well on the establishment of USAID itself. Because in effect, what the administration is asserting it has the right to do is take a lawful federal agency, decide it shouldn't exist anymore, ignore any congressional directive that establishes it and requires it to exist, and shut it down. And then just go to Congress afterwards to let them know what it has done. And that is effectively what it's done at USAID. So they they gave notices of termination to all the staff. They shut down the building. They actually kicked all of the staff out of the headquarters and turned the lease for the headquarters of USAID over to Customs and Border Protection. They took down very petty moves, took down the lettering from the USAID head, and did all this, again, before there had been any formal communication with Congress about any of this. It is not hard to imagine what it means if that is accepted as a valid precedent for executive action. If the president can decide, I don't have to spend money the way that Congress directs it to be spent, I don't have to structure the government the way that Congress through law has structured it, that gives the president virtually unlimited power with virtually no oversight. The president could decide, I'm going to take all of the money from the education department and give it to DHS. He could decide, the possibilities are endless. What I think is important here to then understand is this is the use of a concerted campaign of disinformation to cover a blatant series of violations of the Constitution for a dramatic expansion of executive power. And it just happens to be that USAID was the test case there. And it's very weird to me as a lifelong aid professional, someone who served twice in senior roles at USAID, to find that this kind of little agency that for the most of history no one paid too much attention to now has become really central to the constitutional crisis that our country is in. But that is where we are. It's a very bizarre, when I actually step back and think about it, it really does my head in. It's very strange. But that's where we are. And the New York Times writer Ezra Klein has had some really I think, effective analysis of the larger, kind of what this tells us about the larger game plan. It's what I would call a Humpty Dumpty strategy. So they know they're violating the law. They don't care. They know they're violating the Constitution. They don't care. They know they're disregarding congressional prerogatives. They don't care. And what they're betting is that they can get away with it. They're betting that by the time any of those guardrails catch up, if they ever do, it won't matter because the job will be done. And I think with USAID, they may well get away with that. I hope they do not, but the track things are on. It looks like they will. So, in the same way that in the story of Humpty Dumpty, you push Humpty Dumpty off the wall. Once he hits the ground, all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That is the basic game plan. If they can move really, really fast to destroy USAID, and kind of the key thresholds here for preserving or destroying USAID are shutting down the overseas mission and missions, the overseas work, and firing all the staff, ending all the programs, and the enabling infrastructure that enables foreign aid to be delivered through those programs, and bankrupting the partners that deliver those programs. If you can do those things, if you can achieve those things, whether lawfully or not, if you can get away with achieving those things, then USAID, and not just USAID, but U.S. foreign aid more generally, is functionally dead. And so the game plan here is to do that, is to bankrupt the partners, to end the programs, to fire all the staff, to shutter the agency. And even if courts are throwing up legal challenges here and there, and even if Congress is rumbling with some discontent, unless they are actually stopping you, you keep going. And by the time Congress actually weighs in a serious way, it doesn't matter because it's all gone. Humpty Dumpty has hit the ground. He's in pieces. And that's the end of the story. So that is the game plan. It's what Steve Bannon calls muzzle velocity, that if you move fast enough, if you move faster than the kind of the systems and the norms that we have can catch up to you, you can get away with it. And that is the game plan. And so what I think is really concerning as we then extrapolate further is this is now the game plan we're also seeing at the Department of Education. We're seeing this game plan at the NIH and the CDC. And it does real damage, not just to those institutions, but to U.S. national security. And I am a big believer that our national security is best served when our values and our interests are in alignment. And that's always a delicate tension within kind of that tension was always at the heart of USAID. But what I think made and makes, but I'll have to use past tense fairly soon, USAID so distinctive was that it genuinely wasn't just a charity or a philanthropic institution. It really was a national security institution. And going back to the time of Kennedy, who founded USAID to both advance U.S. interests and U.S. values, and seeing that by advancing U.S. values in the world, we actually served U.S. interests. That was really the core ethos of USAID. And that is what we're losing. And the ways that has protected us, I don't know that we will fully appreciate or understand until some years down the road in some cases. I mean, we can see some of them now. Like we cannot respond to an earthquake anymore. And that one, yes, it's on the other side of the world in Burma, and not many Americans care about it. But if that same event were to happen in Haiti tomorrow, if we saw an earthquake in Haiti like the one we saw in 2010, the response from the U.S. government would not be much more than what we're seeing in Burma. Because in the case of earthquake response, the search and rescue teams still technically have their contracts, although they're not being paid. But the logistics contracts that actually take those teams and fly them around the world, those have all been canceled, so those are inactive now. The support team that would enable the deployment, those people have all been fired. The operations centers that supported those kinds of deployments were in the USAID headquarters, which has been handed over to Customs and Border Protection. So the ability of the U.S. government to manage international crises and respond to international crises has simply been obliterated. It's not there anymore. Now, it could be pulled back if they were to reverse it, but it's not. There's no indication they're going to do that. So we cannot respond to international disasters anymore. We cannot respond to global outbreaks anymore. One of the things that I did when I worked at USAID under Obama was manage the response to the West Africa Ebola outbreak in 2014. If we saw something similar to that today, the U.S. would not be able to engage or respond, both because of the destruction of USAID, but also because they have also been destroying many of the teams at CDC that supported that response. So we are less able to respond to international unable, I would say, to respond to international crises, functionally unable to respond to to global disease threats. We've also pulled out of the WHO, by the way, which is a really fundamental pillar of how we used to respond as well. If there is a global resurgence of HIV, if 20 million people are kicked off their antiretroviral treatments, we will see up to 8 million deaths, 6 million needless deaths from HIV and 8 million new cases of HIV over about the next 5 years. You can't see that happen and think that is not going to affect the health of Americans as well. So there are a lot of ways in which this isn't just about kind of doing good in the world, although it is in part about that, but it really does protect Americans and serve American interests. And we are completely losing the ability to do that. So it is both a constitutional crisis and a national security crisis to lose what USAID has for 60 plus years done on behalf of the American people. And I want to maybe to wrap on the USAID point. Everyone who worked at USAID, all the people that I worked with in my 5 years there over 2 tours, really felt strongly that they were working on behalf of their country. Every member of USAID takes the oath of office before they join the agency, and they swear allegiance to the Constitution. And that was a very strongly felt ethos at USAID, as it is in all the federal government. And one of the most touching moments for me amidst a lot of pain of watching the agency be dismantled was when USAID staff who had all gotten termination notices were allowed to go back into the building briefly to collect their personal effects before the headquarters was completely turned over to CBP. And many of those teams, when they came out, would gather together and repeat the oath. And it was an incredibly I don't think Elon Musk has ever said the oath of office, for what it's worth, but it was an incredibly moving moment that I think just really reinforced that was what motivated them. That was what motivated the people of USAID. It was the ability to do good in the world in service of your country, which is an incredibly powerful and motivating and meaningful thing. Just quickly, what we saw in the case of USAID was a game plan that started in the international space or began by targeting non-Americans, then provided the template that was applied to domestic institutions. And I think we are very much at risk of seeing something similar when it comes to migration enforcement. So what we are seeing in migration enforcement now, beyond, including refugees, but beyond refugees and asylum seekers, is a willingness to throw aside the law, the same willingness we saw with USAID, a willingness to disregard the law until the courts force them to do otherwise. A disregard for the human toll of what is happening. So in the same way that they were willing to risk the lives of millions of people overseas by cutting off HIV treatment and food aid, we are also seeing similar risks to people with the cutoff of refugee resettlement programs, which Krish will talk about, but also the willingness to take people who are living lives in American communities and put them into a torture prison gulag in El Salvador with no due process. And so we see that in the El Salvador case. We see a similar disregard for the law and for basic American norms with the targeting of immigrants based on their speech. And I think we must not ignore that when those tools, those techniques that are being honed by targeting non-Americans, I think it's inevitable they will be turned upon Americans at some point. So we should not see foreign aid as completely separate from a willingness to tolerate a lot of human toll domestically with domestic changes. We should not see a willingness to persecute individuals based on their speech or send them to horrible prisons without due process as being limited only to non-Americans. It will occur for Americans as well. And actually, the president just the other day said he thought it would be great to send American criminals to El Salvador too. So we need to fight these things here. We need to, these are the hills we need to die on, because if we don't die on these hills, we will die on the next hills. I'll maybe pause there on that. But I do think these are also winnable fights, and maybe I'll end on this. Right now, it very much feels like on many of the things that I and my organization care about, we are losing left, right, and center. And I think that is true as a matter of raw politics right now. It's not true as a matter of public opinion. We just conducted a poll with one of Trump's favorite polling firms, a group called Signal, that found that by a 20-point margin, 56 to 36%, American voters oppose deporting and expelling people who have come here legally seeking protection through refugee asylum and parole. You would never think that from the political zeitgeist, but that is actually where the public is. There is still a lot of support for USAID out there. The gaslighting has, it has dampened support a bit, but it hasn't crushed it. It's brought it down by 4 or 5%. So these things are not popular. And to go back and maybe end on this point, Ezra Klein, when he talks about the muzzle velocity approach, the point he makes is they have to ignore the courts, they have to ignore Congress, because they wouldn't succeed otherwise. If they were strong, if they had public support for these things, if these things were popular with Congress, if they were lawful, they would do them in the lawful way, and they're not. So it should be seen and understood as a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength, that they are using these techniques. But that also means we need to fight, because if they get away with ignoring the law in this way, then the implications of that have much wider implications for our democracy. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for those important remarks, Jeremy, because I was especially excited when I was told that I would be sharing the stage with Jeremy, who I have counted as a friend and partner for a very long time. And since those State Department USAID days, including the Ebola response, I know that what you've seen in terms of his compassion and leadership are so pivotal at this moment. I also just want to thank the council because obviously I have been able to serve as a board member, and I know that organizing these kinds of conversations is so critically important, because these topics are still not getting enough attention, despite the staggering stakes. And I know that this conversation is not unique, whether we're talking about Ukraine or other international dynamics. And so I just wanted to say grateful, because I think it is incredibly important for us to spend a lot more time on these topics. Because the reality is that when we talk about these topics, we aren't just talking about bureaucratic reshuffling or budget line items. We are talking about the abrupt dismantling of two of the most consequential expressions of American leadership, U.S. foreign aid and our refugee resettlement system. And as Jeremy mentioned, this is something that is going to come home to roost, whether it's tomorrow or in a month or in a year. What we are seeing is a warning that we have to take in the most grave fashion. From my perspective, I think it's important to highlight how when we talk about these topics, it's not budgets, it's not acronyms tossed around in policy circles. These are lifelines. These are strategic tools of foreign policy and military might. They are reflections of who we are and how we lead. As Roy mentioned, I lead Global Refuge. We're one of the largest refugee resettlement organizations in the country. I've seen firsthand how U.S. refugee policy has translated into the safety of survivors of war and persecution, into family reunification, into giving the chance to a child who may have been in a refugee camp the first opportunity to come to school. for a woman to launch a business and rebuild her life. I've also, as Jeremy noted, have worked inside government. So I know the rigor, the partnerships, the strategic calculus that goes into crafting our aid and immigration systems. I also know that when Congress appropriates these programs, it is a buzzsaw to get to the point that you actually get the appropriation and the requirement on a federal agency to execute. So what's happening now is not reform. It's not efficiency. It's not strategic recalibration. There is no grand strategy beyond the intentional dismantling and decimation of a working system. So in our case, and what I'll speak to in my remarks, is the dismantling of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, which was created as a federal program in 1980 with overwhelming bipartisan support. Roy mentioned this, but I just want to underscore it. 3.6 million people have been able to rebuild their lives in safety and dignity. These are people fleeing violence, persecution, often unimaginable trauma. And for decades, America has offered them something more powerful than just protection. We've offered them a real future. Only after years of extensive vetting, and yes, we're going to sound a little defensive about this program because there's a lot of misinformation about it, but it is only after extreme vetting that they are able to come here to rebuild their lives. We are one of 10 resettlement partners, and so what our work involves is we will pick up a refugee family at the airport. We will help find them affordable housing. Not an easy task, as you know, just by reading the headlines these days. We'll help even stock the refrigerator with culturally familiar foods. From there, our case managers will work with the families to help them find jobs. We know that our clients, they don't want government handouts. They want to be self-sufficient. So we find that the vast majority are self-sufficient within 6 months. We help them access health care, enroll their kids in school, connect them to community resources, help find jobs so that they do reach that self-sufficiency. Our history, as Roy mentioned, is a long-standing one. So we were founded by American Lutherans over 85 years ago. The work began resettling Lutheran pastors, professors, others who were fleeing Nazi Germany in 1939, but that mandate quickly expanded. So we've been able to respond to every immigration crisis since then, whether it was the Vietnamese fleeing Saigon, Cubans fleeing Fidel Castro, the lost boys and girls of Sudan, persecuted Christians, displaced Ukrainians, Afghan allies who stood shoulder to shoulder with our U.S. troops and our U.S. mission. But of course, that legacy, which has been many decades in the making, is now in jeopardy. So just as Jeremy described, we had a similar experience. So on day one, the president issued an executive order suspending arrivals from the refugee program. Then days later, we also received stop work orders, effectively halting the support that would go to refugee families. And then all 10 resettlement agencies received termination notices. And tragically, the humanitarian toll has been swift and severe. So families who were just days away from reuniting with loved ones who were here in the United States, who had already packed their bags, they had sold their personal belongings. They had given up temporary housing because they had been given the assurance that they were going to be resettled here in the United States. They had said their goodbyes, only to be told, as they had plane tickets in hand, that they wouldn't be able to join their family members in the United States after years of separation. So they're now stranded abroad in limbo. They're unsure when or even if they'll be allowed to reunite with their loved ones on the safety of American soil. And so in the face of funding cuts, I know you mentioned the Catholics. So for nearly 2 months, we, being over 90% federally funded, which separate matter, happy to talk about that issue, we're receiving not a dime of reimbursement. And so when Jeremy describes an intentional strategy, it is one of bleeding out nonprofits. I know that there's others in the audience. And so in the face of funding cuts, our team has been forced to juggle the impossible choices as we stretch dwindling resources to cover growing needs. So for refugee families already here, paying the rent has become a daunting challenge. Parents are worried sick about how they'll be able to keep a roof over their head. I guess I would also add that in some ways, the Trump administration's policies have hit us in two ways, because not only are we not able to support them in its entirety, but also when we try to get employers to hire these amazing refugee clients, we're being told by them, look, I have no idea what's going on with these tariffs. One day I'm told that they're not going to happen. The next day I'm told that they are. And then I get information that they're being pushed off for 90 days for the tailor-made trade policies. And I think even that volatility has affected our clients. So a few weeks ago, I met a couple who had come from Guatemala. So I'll refer to them as Carlos and Maria. When I met them, they had brought their 1-year-old daughter along. She was dressed in this adorable little pink sweatsuit, and she was amazingly behaving, just sitting there listening to the conversation we were having, playing with her toys. So Carlos and Maria had made an incredibly difficult decision to flee from Guatemala. That's obviously the only home that they had ever had, because they had started receiving threats from the former Guatemalan government. And their situation was so dire that every time that they would go to work each day, they feared whether they would be able to return to their young daughter. And so after applying through the Refugee Admissions Program, they were finally able to arrive in the U.S. This past June. So when they spoke about the resettlement experience, they were clearly incredibly grateful to the United States in terms of the humanitarian leadership that they had showed. They were grateful to Global Refuge in terms of the support they received, from food to housing, to helping them get a job. And they were, I think, especially thankful to their case manager, Araceli, who had clearly become family, because it was clear from their discussion she'd really gone above and beyond to help them get settled. And there was just a clear bond of love between them. Unfortunately, Carlos, Maria, and their daughter were not the only family members who were being targeted. And so they had other family members who were also going through the refugee resettlement process. And I want to stress this, right? We had told them this was the process by which you applied to come to the United States, and they had done so. So they were, going through this process, and then, of course, everything came to an abrupt halt on January 20th. And it was heartbreaking to see Maria, who is now pregnant with their second child, crying out of fear for what may happen to her family that she left behind. And as Carlos and Maria were telling me their story, I couldn't help, when I saw their daughter, to think about my own daughter. So my younger one just turned 2. We celebrated her birthday this weekend. And I had mixed emotions, just thinking about how it was wonderful to see their young daughter safe, with this bright future ahead of her here, but awful just to know that the family had no idea whether they would see their family again, whether they would know if their daughter could be held by a grandparent again. And, whether it's them or Rose, who I also met with on that visit in San Antonio, she had fled the brutal conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2015. She had been living in Zambia. She was being targeted there for being Congolese. So she had arrived in the U.S. just days before arrivals were suspended. And so in the first few weeks here, as she was really just trying to orient herself, she wasn't able to get cash assistance for food as a result of the federal funding freeze. And unfortunately, these are anecdotal examples, but these cases are not alone in any way. So when the government issued the stop work order, Global Refuge, is just one organization, had resettled 6,000 refugees who had arrived in the U.S. in just the past 90 days. This is obviously not foreign aid in the classic sense, because these are people who are already here in the United States. They're our newest neighbors, and their success is really our success. But of course, now their lives have been plunged into uncertainty. So just put yourself in their shoes. Imagine for a moment that you waited in a refugee camp or in a country that was never your home but was willing to take you in. You had waited for years and years as you weren't certain of whether the refugee system would resettle you, knowing that only 1% of refugees are ever resettled. So you finally get told you're going to be resettled. You come to the United States. You arrive tired and overwhelmed. You're grateful. You finally see a brighter future. And then the resources to help you get your sea legs are suddenly taken away. A case manager, possibly the only friendly face and possibly the only person who speaks your language, is no longer able to meet with you. And it's heart-wrenching because so much has been lost in just a matter of 2 months. And I'm not referring just to what refugees have lost, but what the United States stands to lose by closing the door on them. So as a former State Department official myself, I think that the framework that we heard during Secretary Rubio's confirmation hearing could be useful in using the administration's priorities as a measure of whether refugee resettlement really hits the mark in terms of a policy that makes sense. So that framework basically asks the question, does it make the United States safer, stronger, and more prosperous? And I'd argue that the answer is a definitive yes to each of those 3 questions. So first, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program makes the country safer through a vetted process for legal immigration. In fact, when you look at longitudinal studies that have taken the top 10 cities that have resettled the highest number of refugees per capita, 9 of those 10 cities are actually safer across basically every measure of crime compared to similar cities. One example, there was the exception, was Springfield, Massachusetts, which was also at that time period going through an opioid epidemic. And so with so much misinformation about this issue, I think it is so important to understand that these are individuals who've gone through Department of Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, Interpol, in order for them to come to the United States. So second, the refugee program makes the country stronger through advancing U.S. interests, like supporting allies in conflict zones. This is the program that includes special pathways for those who served alongside U.S. troops in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq as translators, as drivers, as intelligence aides. So heaven forbid the U.S. has to put our armed forces in harm's way again. We know from the mouths of national security leaders that they've been crystal clear. We absolutely need local support to be successful. And so this is where resettling allies bolsters trust with future partners. And beyond just fulfilling a moral and a military obligation, it also helps draw a strategic and stark contrast with our geopolitical rivals like China and Russia. And finally, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program makes the U.S. more prosperous through the economic contributions of refugees, which are enormous. If you look at a study that was done by the Department of Health and Human Services, it found that over a 15-year period, refugees contributed $124 billion more in taxes than they ever consumed in public benefits. And beyond the tax contributions, there are critical contributions that they make to our labor force, particularly at a time when we have about 7.7 million jobs that are open. Refugees play an essential and outsized role in industries like healthcare, food production, elder care, childcare, transportation, often in areas where we are struggling to attract workers. And that's particularly important for communities that are experiencing a population decline. Because I think it's important when you hear these assertions that the country's full. Well, take, for example, where we're meeting, here in Baltimore. Obviously, Baltimore's population has been on a decline for decades. And many here tonight, I hope, appreciate that there may be a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Because last year, so in 2024, we saw our population grow for the first time in decades. And that's thanks largely to international migration to the city. Now, it may be very modest gains in residents, but I'm immensely proud of the role that Global Refuge may have played in terms of bringing new life to Baltimore. And we have other examples all across the country. The fact is, cities who have embraced resettlement, like Erie, Pennsylvania, Clarkston, Georgia, Utica, New York, have seen population and economic rebounds as a result. Jobs get filled, jobs get created, new businesses open, vacant housing fills, all of which reverse urban decline. And so I know I could, stay here and talk to you about statistics and studies, but if we only talk about the numbers, I think we also risk something, which is to lose the soul of this work. I've shared a few client stories in terms of their journeys, but I also thought it may be helpful to make this a little bit personal. So I thought I'd share, my personal story. So I was born in Sri Lanka. I won't tell you exactly what year, but this administration has given me gray hair, so take that into account. My parents were part of the ethnic and religious minority in Sri Lanka, and so as a result, as the country was on the brink of civil war, my parents knew they had to get out. And thankfully, my uncle, who was a neurosurgeon, just as we have a situation now of needing healthcare workers, was recruited to rural Texas to practice there. And so this was, I guess you could say, the heyday of immigration, where he sponsored his brothers and sisters. And just as we were going to move to Nigeria, because my parents were teachers and they had gotten jobs to move there, we learned that our visas had come through, and we came to the United States. And when we arrived, my brother, Thuru, some of you may know him, he was 3 years old, and I was 9 months. And I look at packing up for the weekend with my 7-year-old and my now 2-year-old, and I'm like, oh my gosh, the idea of traveling halfway around the world with nothing except for a 3-year-old and a 9 months old baby, no jobs, just $200 in their pockets. And I realized their bravery. And that's honestly the self-selection of so many who take that risk, who come to the U.S. So my dad had to get a job. He would actually, back in the day, he had at least in his head that he would just print out his resume. We immigrant story, lived in the basement of my aunt and uncle in New York. And so he would take this printed resume to the World Trade Center, thinking he would just hand it out and that was how he would land a job. Got a little distracted because, bear in mind, my parents are coming to a new country, new language, even things like new technology. So just like the elevator we took here in the World Trade Center, he would go up and down in the World Trade Center in New York because he thought it was like a roller coaster ride. Talk about cheap thrills. And so he didn't get a job that way, not surprising. But fortunately, my mother had taught at Poly. She had a connection to the Baltimore City public school system. My dad interviewed with the superintendent of the schools on a Thursday, got a job on Friday. We moved that weekend. It was the superintendent who found the basement apartment that we moved into in Edmondson Heights. It was the vice principal of the school who literally helped us move our bags in and vouched for my parents as they started a bank account. And it was the churches and temples who donated winter clothes to a family that had never seen a flake of snow. We came from a tropical island. And it was that warm welcome that we received. My parents were educators. That was the springboard of opportunity for us. So when you talk about those degrees and the hundreds of thousands of dollars I racked up in student loans, it was that springboard that gave me the chance to go from Woodlawn to the White House. And so I know how life-changing the experience of being welcomed into the United States can be. And I think that is perhaps why it is so painful to see that legacy of welcome and the infrastructure that made it possible being torn down. Because I think if we are asking ourselves that question of, is this the end of refugee resettlement as we know it? It could be. If we do nothing, if we grow numb to cruelty, if we retreat into cynicism, if we let the dismantling of a life-saving program go unanswered, then yes, it could be. But I don't believe that's where our story ends. Because what we're witnessing isn't just the unraveling of a program, and really programs. It's a referendum on who we are as a nation. And Jeremy gave you the stats about where the American public is, if we can get them to tune in. Because this isn't a struggle between left and right. It's one between retreat and resolve. It's between fear and faith, between isolationism and the idea that our strength is greatest when our arms are open, not closed. And I know that sitting in this room tonight are people who still believe that. And so I guess this is the second rally cry that you're hearing tonight. Because people who understand that resettling a refugee is not a burden, but a contribution, is who we need on our sides. It's not charity, it's an investment in ourselves. It's not weakness, it is the truest expression of American leadership. And I'll be honest, this is probably the hardest chapter I've experienced in this work. I complained to my husband who runs the National Wildlife Federation, and so we're both kind of on the receiving ends of this. It is so hard to work downstream from decisions that you can't control. But the reality is that we have no choice, because in a matter of weeks, we've gone from welcoming families to wondering how we keep the lights on. From planning for expansion to helping clients navigate housing crises and hunger. But in the midst of these moments of disruption, we are also reminded of what's most essential. We're reminded that leadership isn't about press releases, it's about people. That policy is not about numbers, it's about lives. And that rebuilding, whether it's the rebuilding of a city like Baltimore, or a program like the Refugee Admissions Program, or a promise like the American Dream, is slow and sacred work. So what can we do? We can raise our voices. Refugee resettlement may not dominate cable news, but it is vital. Maybe we can make that go viral. And when enough people speak up, when ordinary citizens, churches, veterans, business owners, educators, and elected officials come together, we've seen what's possible. So I encourage you, wherever possible, share the stories of refugee clients that you may have met. Share the story of Global Refuge. There is so much of a groundswell of support that I know is in people's hearts and in their minds, but we need to have it heard. If you have the chance to talk to a neighbor, a friend, a church, at your book club, the gas station, please tell them about this work. Tell them about the importance of welcoming the stranger. Sign up for our advocacy newsletter. Right now, Congress may not be as engaged as we want, but things can change. My development officer would ask me, I think he put this in the speech, give, whether it's time, resources, expertise to organizations like Global Refuge, others. We know that part of what we face is figuring out how, if the government steps back, others step forward. And then finally, we can keep telling the story of what's at stake. Because here's the thing, refugee resettlement isn't just about saving lives. It's about saving who we are. For generations, this country has opened its doors to people in search of safety. And in doing so, we have found teachers, doctors, artists, scientists, soldiers, and cherished neighbors who enrich every corner of this nation. That's the promise my family was given. That's the promise that Carlos and Maria are clinging to. And that's the promise that we're fighting to keep alive. So is this the end? I don't believe it is. But I do believe it's a moment that demands from all of us clarity, courage, and commitment. Because every generation gets to decide what kind of country we'll be. I hope we'll be remembered as the generation that chose welcome, that chose compassion, that chose not to walk away, but to rebuild. Thank you.
I should mention that the Council itself does not take a stand on foreign affairs issues. We are nonpartisan. We don't take positions. But we want to air the positions. We want to air the facts so that you can make your minds up about the issues themselves. Why don't we start with this gentleman here, John?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you both. Excellent presentation, but this question is directed at you, Jeremy. You mentioned national security implications, and if you could just reference USAID in particular. So it said nature abhors a vacuum, right? So do you have current examples of where foreign countries, for example, China or others, Iran, whomever, are filling that vacuum as we speak?
Yeah, and I think filling the vacuum is probably that's not the way I'd characterize. Thank you. How's that? Can you hear? Yeah. I think I just wasn't holding it close enough. I got to really have it right up there. I don't think it's that they're filling the vacuum per se. I would say they're capitalizing on the vacuum. We should not expect that China or anyone can replace what the United States does in the world. In the humanitarian sector, which I know the best, the U.S. provides about 40% of the funding. We are the only country in the world that is both a large economy and a rich economy. China is a large economy, but it's not a rich economy. India, similar. Germany is a rich economy, but it's not relative to us a large economy. Because we are both, we have a really outsized role in financing the global humanitarian system. China's not going to come in and fill that. What they will do is capitalize on our absence, capitalize on our departure. They will make a few, and we've seen them doing this in like health programs in Southeast Asia. They will choose a few high-profile examples and say, we're going to take that on. And so it creates the impression that they are filling the vacuum. They're not going to actually fill the vacuum in the services that are being lost, but they will get the benefit, the kind of diplomacy benefit of that, the relationship benefit of that. And they are also behind the scenes going to countries and saying, look, the U.S. government is unreliable. If they are going to kick 5 million people off of antiretroviral treatment in South Africa with no glide path, with no transition plan, how can you rely on them as a partner for anything? I think that, so there are ways in which our the U.S.'s geopolitical adversaries will capitalize on this, and they absolutely will and are, and we're seeing cases of that. But they're not going to do so by continuing our work. They're going to continue. They're going to do so by kind of casting us as a bad partner. And and ultimately, if you're a country like Brazil or Panama or Vietnam, you have a choice of who you're going to partner with. China is looking much more attractive right now than the United States because we look unreliable, we look erratic, and they don't. One example of how I think our model has served us better traditionally. So when I was working, I led COVID relief at USAID for the first 2 years of the Biden administration. China's vaccine diplomacy, before we began to donate vaccines, their approach was basically to go to a country and say, we will sell our vaccines to you at a very high cost, often more than $20 a dose. And in exchange for the privilege of purchasing our marked up vaccines, you need to make political and economic concessions. So it's very transactional and extractive. You need to withdraw your political recognition of Taiwan, or you need to give us access to your resources. And if countries did that, then they could buy the vaccines. And a lot of countries took that deal because they had no other option. When we began our vaccine program, we donated our vaccines. We didn't sell them. We didn't extract political concessions, although it did reinforce our ties with those countries, but not in a kind of overtly extractive way. And that meant both we were a preferred partner to those countries, but it also meant they didn't have to take that deal from China anymore. So we were able to outflank China not by playing their game, but by playing a different and better game.
So basically, it's inevitable millions of people are going to die as a result of this. So U.S. food aid supports I think it's about 50 million people a year. There are 20 million people who are kept alive by U.S.-funded antiretroviral treatments who would succumb to their HIV infections if not for that. So yeah, I think it's very plausible that if all that goes away, that you would be talking a human toll in the millions of people.
Next question, please.
Hi, thank you to both of you for your wonderful presentation and a really important presentation. I have a comment and a question. My comment is I work for an organization that was primarily funded by the USAID and other, it's an international organization, of course, and other U.S. government. And we won't talk about what happened with the organization right now. But according to, I think it was the New York Times, and this is my comment, Elon Musk's, idea that he started with USAID, basically, was always questionable. Like, if you're going to destroy the government, why start with USAID when nobody knows it? You start with big, CDC or Department of Education. But in the New York Times, I read that Elon Musk, who of course is from South Africa, grew up there during apartheid, and it turns out the USAID was critical in helping black people in apartheid. And so the first government to go down, part of the government, was the USAID. That was not a mistake. My question is, as part of, because I work for the organization, we and others have joined forces to file lawsuits. And you mentioned, and this is a question for either of you, it was mentioned that there are court cases. I'd like you to go a little bit more in detail. We filed court cases, and case after case after case, multiple court cases, they all came back in our favor or against USAID, and they were ignored. And so I want you to focus or talk a little bit about, so what good does these court cases have now?
And Jeremy, can I ask you to be concise as possible, because we're in overtime.
And Krish, you may want to speak to this because it's the same dynamic in the resettlement case. So yes, I'm not going to speculate why Elon targeted USAID, but there's a clear vengefulness to his approach. You can read into that what you will. What we have seen over and over in the lawsuits is that the administration has to be arm twisted even into doing the bare legal minimum that's required by the courts. So rather than comply, they immediately appeal, and immediately appeal. They make no move to comply. And it came to a point in, I think, the lawsuit you're referring to, which was filed by USAID partners, demanding that at minimum they should be paid for the work they had already completed. Even for that, the government resisted and resisted and resisted and resisted, and it literally went to the Supreme Court before finally they ran out of runway because they lost at the Supreme Court, and only then did they begin paying. And only once they began paying, they did so very slowly and processing only a few hundred payments a day, which compared to what USAID would normally do is very minimal. I do think they're important, and I think they're important because despite all of that, it slows down the damage. It brings facts into the public view. So, things that it forces the government to admit and acknowledge and justify in public, in court, what it is doing. So this is not Elon making wild claims on his Twitter feed. This is the government having to swear in affidavits before a federal judge what they are doing. And that is very clarifying because it shows how reckless and poorly handled this has been and how they are in total noncompliance with the law.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll just quickly add, USAID's OIG had an investigation of Musk's, I think it was Starlink company, so take that for what it's worth. We know from the refugee resettlement space, there was a specific memorandum to focus on Afrikaners as a priority population. So clearly there are some fingerprints in terms of policies. And I also would share Jeremy's view on don't give up hope on the cases. We were under both the Vaccine Coalition case as well as a case in the Seattle Federal District Court. We were able to receive one of our payments, we think perhaps as a result. But what is alarming and which we should all be watching very closely is the administration is not liking losing in court. And of course, now we're seeing the retaliation against law firms.
Thanks, both.
Next question, and please be as concise as possible.
Very emotional and educational presentation. Thank you very much. How many millions of refugees are out there now, and how do you select or attempt to select them?
Yeah, so like a couple years ago, we crossed what we thought was an unprecedented mark of over 100 million. But now we're well over 25 million. And this is only growing, right? Because that had been because of the more traditional reasons like war, persecution, violence related issues. But this doesn't fully take into account even the climate crisis, which is going to cause climate displaced persons. That could be up to 1 billion people. And so there is a very regulated system that's administered by the United Nations as well as the U.S. You have to meet certain criteria. But you also need to have the host nations like the United States. The U.S. has always been a global leader. And when we lead, other countries follow. And when we step back, other countries use that as an excuse. So this is going to have a massive ripple effect across the globe.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Aaron, you have some questions from Zoom?
Yes, thank you both for coming. I have some of the questions from our Zoom audience. This is more focused on refugee resettlement. So in the absence of any sort of government funding or support, kind of what do our options look like? If there was the philanthropic support out there, would that actually be enough to cover the work of Global Refuge and other organizations like it? And are we going to need to start looking at kind of more local solutions to refugee resettlement, kind of like what you were talking about in your story? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, great question. And it has been incredibly heartening to be based in Baltimore, because I will say it is amazing the foundations that immediately responded and said, look, what do you need? How can we help? The reality is that this used to be a program that was done organically, grassroots level, before it became a federal program. There is a value to the professionalization that resulted from it being a federally administered program that we will lose, but we cannot give up. Even if this means we go old school, that is the route that we have to go. And I think that is where it's going to be incredibly important for us to make sure that companies, foundations, community-based groups, congregations are all involved in this work.
Thank you.
So I have one question for you. A few days ago, the Associated Press reported that the World Food Program funds that the U.S. provides, something like 4 or 5 billion of the 10 or 11 billion in the World Food Program, that the U.S. was pulling out, basically, and canceled all of its contracts. That was on Monday. Yesterday, I read that the money had been restored, that the World Food Program had warned there was going to be mass deaths from the absence of U.S. aid to the very poor countries that were receiving it. As I say, but yesterday it was reversed. So I'm wondering, who's running the store? I mean, how can they have let this happen in the first place? And then how did this miraculous reversal come about?
So when the aid pause was issued, very soon after the stop work order was issued, very soon thereafter, Secretary Rubio issued a policy directive that life-saving health and humanitarian programs should be exempted. But the problem is that came from Secretary Rubio, and most of this work is being run by members of DOGE, who are under Elon Musk and don't particularly care what Secretary Rubio has to say about it. So we have seen over and over that this guidance from Secretary Rubio, which is being used to justify, that this is not a harmful or reckless process, is completely ignored in practice. And so over and over, we have seen life-saving programs canceled, terminated, paused. So the latest round was, as you say, with World Food Program. So within just over a week of the State Department having sent a formal report to Congress articulating which programs they had canceled and which were still running, including many of the life-saving humanitarian programs and those that were then canceled, they then turned around and canceled something like 30 or 40 new humanitarian awards, most of which still have not been turned back on, by the way, including 6 of the largest WFP awards in the world. So all of the food aid going into Afghanistan, all of the food aid going into Yemen, all of the food aid going into Somalia, several other countries. They have turned several of those back on now. They have not, as I understand it, turned back on the Yemen or the Afghanistan funding. And this is well, anyway. I could
But
go on a length that I
Syria
won't,
was
but it
turned on.
will kill people.
Syria was turned on.
Syria
again.
was turned back on,
Wow.
but these cuts will kill people. And what the backstory here is that the person who is running USAID now is a 28-year-old former law student who is a member of DOJ, who knows nothing about foreign aid, and in his wisdom decided that these things should be canceled, notwithstanding what the secretary said. And then there was, of course, a blow up, and he then reversed that and sent a very odd message around to the senior staff at USAID saying, in effect, oops, my bad, we shouldn't have done that. And I'm not exaggerating in that language. I mean, that was more or less the wording of the email. It was an oopsie. There is no process, there is no thought that goes into this. There's no consideration of the human toll. There's no pretense of asking anyone who knows what these programs do what the damage will be. There's just an assumption that they're all garbage and can all be terminated with no collateral damage. And of course, we know that's not true, but they don't care, and they don't care to find out. And so they do huge damage.
We have one last question, if you can be as concise as possible.
Yes. Thank you. I've really enjoyed your presentation.
And come closer to the mic, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. My question is more about whether or not there's been any studies or thoughts or projections on if things continue to go the way they are and not in a positive direction, in terms of migration. How do we see that happening as people start leaving their native countries and looking for better opportunities? Is one thing, but just basic food, clothing, shelter, education, safety, and things like that. And how would that impact I will be very transparent here. How would this impact our allies, in Europe, as people move from other countries that are non-European? And how would that actually shape some of the politics and the mindsets of people in these countries when they're suddenly have to shift and think differently? Has there been any kind of projections on that, and
Krish.
when that could take effect? And I appreciate also what you're saying about, I just retired from the UN like on the 31st. So the horror stories and the wonderful things and so much collateral damage that you haven't even been able to get to, and so many other areas, water and sanitation, health, malnutrition, so many things. And it's more devastating than we've even been able to express here today.
So I'll start, but Jeremy's also an expert on this, so well, please. So the reality is that even right now, not taking into account kind of the accelerants for increased mass migrations, we complain about how much we've done, and the reality is that we are only taking in a fraction of what other countries with fewer resources are doing in terms of Turkey or Jordan. Even looking at the mass migration out of Ukraine, 7 or 8 million who went to other parts of the country. Moldova with just a couple 100,000 people. And so I think this is where it is incredibly important for us to both acknowledge that the U.S., as we decided on a brand name, there was a little concern I had about global refuge, because I think some people misinterpret it as the U.S. ought to be the global refuge for everyone. We obviously cannot do that, right? But we're also experiencing the very same dynamics that we're seeing in Europe that is fueling these far-right anti-immigration parties from coming to power. And so I think my pitch to people has been, look, you may not care about immigration as like the central passion project, but you have to realize that immigration is the spearhead that is changing policies to places where you don't want to go, so that your pet project is going to be impacted as well. And so I think this is where it really is going to require a not just national but a global response to figure out we need to do our part in terms of being a refuge for some of the conflicts we created, the climate crisis that we fueled, but that we cannot do that for everyone. And so every country needs to play its part. And we need to invest in these nations precisely through USAID, through the State Department, through climate treaties, through multilateral organizations, so that we can also stop, kind of, this is like address these issues at the root source, because that has to be the multifaceted response in order to make the system work to some extent.
Jeremy, you want the last word?
Sure. I'm so glad you asked that question, because what we often encounter in the forces that oppose any sort of humane management of migration is this sense that if we are the littlest bit humane, we will be overrun, we will be overwhelmed, everyone in the world will try to come here. And that is untrue. But it's untrue for a purpose. And I think it's important to understand, when you're hearing that kind of rhetoric, the intent is to scare you into being ungenerous and to scare you into being closed. The real numbers, as Krish said, about 125 million people forcibly displaced around the world. The largest share, the substantial majority of those are what are called internally displaced people, meaning they are in their own country. They have not migrated. They are displaced, but they have not migrated. The next largest share are refugees, about 45 million right now around the world. 3/4 of those refugees are displaced to a neighboring country. So they are not coming to the United States. They are not coming to Europe. They are Venezuelans in Colombia, or they are Syrians in Jordan, Afghans in Pakistan. And for the most part, that is where they want to stay, because they want to go home. They don't want to leave permanently. They want to be able to eventually go home. So already what we're talking about is a kind of a subset of the total displaced population that will even come to the U.S., try to come to a rich, global North, global West country. We can manage that if we choose to, and we are choosing not to. And this is what really frustrates me about the politics around this is, yes, there has been chaos and disorder because we are choosing not to manage a problem. And then that becomes a kind of self-licking ice cream cone where the chaos and disorder justifies the non-management, which then leads to more chaos and disorder. Look at what Europe did with the Ukrainians. 4 million people fled Ukraine very, very rapidly in a very short period of time. And if Europe had managed that the way they managed the Mediterranean migration crisis, most of those people would be trapped on the border or would be in squalid camps in southern Poland. That's not what they did. They gave them legal status, they shared burden across EU member states, and they were rapidly able to absorb 4 million people without skipping a beat. So what that tells you is that the issue is not mechanics, the issue is not absorptive capacity. The issue is, do you choose to manage the problem or not? And if you choose to manage it, it can be managed.
So on that note, I have to say your image of Humpty Dumpty scares me.
Scares me too.
Leaves me a little bit depressed. What you just now said is a bit more encouraging. And I thought what Krish said about her own story and the story of the Guatemalan family really gave me heart and hope. And that you think that there should be some way of making this, restoring this function that we played. Can we thank the speakers for an outstanding presentation? Really excellent. Thank you again.